My best friend stole my husband on our wedding night. Years later, she begged for mercy. The drums stopped first. That was how Adaeze knew something was wrong. At her own wedding, in the compound her father had swept and decorated with palm fronds and white lilies for 3 days, the drums stopped in the middle of the high life song everyone had been dancing to, and in the silence that followed, someone screamed her name. Adaeze, Ada, come quickly. She was in the small room behind the canopy, still in her white gown, still smelling of the perfume Chioma had sprayed on her wrists an hour earlier, laughing, adjusting her veil, whispering, "Obinna is a lucky man, Ada. God has been good to you." She remembered Chioma's hands on her shoulders, steady and warm, the way they had always been steady and warm since they were 7 years old and shared a desk in community primary school, Umuahia. She would remember those hands for the rest of her life, not for their warmth, for what they had done 2 hours later. When Ada ran out from behind the canopy, her mother was on her knees in the sand, wailing in a voice Ada had never heard before, a voice that did not sound like her mother at all, a voice that sounded like something breaking. Her father stood frozen by the drinks table, a bottle of Chapman still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the gate. Guests were murmuring, phones were raised, and somewhere in the crowd, someone was already saying words that Ada's mind refused to accept. "Obinna don enter Chiomaka. Dem don comot." Gone. Her groom, in his wedding suit, had climbed into her best friend's car, and they had driven out of the compound gate while the second round of jollof rice was still being served. An hour before, Ada had watched Chioma cross the compound in her lilac asoebi, greeting elders, laughing with the photographer, behaving so entirely like herself that not a single person present would later admit to noticing anything strange. Even Mama Nkiru, the sharp-tongued caterer who claimed she could smell trouble in a room before it happened, would say afterward that she had seen nothing, only a bride's best friend doing what best friends do, fussing over flowers, checking on the cake, making sure the day went smoothly. What no one saw was the small leather bag Chioma had left in the boot of her car that morning, packed the night before with 2 changes of clothes and a folder of documents she had been told to keep safe. What no one saw was Obinna slipping away from the men's tent twice during the reception, phone pressed to his ear, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding his own father's table each time he returned. What no one saw, because it happened in whispers behind the generator house, was Chief Maduike gripping his son's wrist and saying 4 words that would detonate Adaze's entire life. Today, it must be today. Ada did not scream. Later, people would talk about that, how the bride did not scream, did not cry, only stood very still in her white gown with her hands folded in front of her, as if she was waiting for someone to explain that this was a joke, a prank cooked up by her cousins, the kind of thing young men did before you started laughing and the music came back on. The music did not come back on. Her uncle, Chief Okonkwo, was the one who finally moved, storming toward the gate, shouting for someone to bring a car, to chase them, to catch them before they reached the expressway. 2 of Ada's cousins actually did climb into a Hilux and speed down the untarred road toward the main highway, returning an hour later, dust-covered and empty-handed, shaking their heads at the crowd that had gathered to hear whether the bride's honor could still somehow be salvaged. It could not. By the time the cousins returned, half the guests had already quietly slipped away, taking their asoebi and their gift envelopes with them, leaving behind only family and the kind of curious neighbors who could not resist watching a tragedy unfold to its very end. There was nowhere to chase them to. Nobody knew where they had gone. And somewhere deep inside her, in a place she would spend years trying to silence, Adaeze already understood that this was not a sudden madness. This was something that had been planned. 3 hours earlier, Chioma had zipped up the back of her wedding gown with those same careful hands and said, "You look like a queen, Ada. Obinna will thank God every day of his life that he married you." Ada would ask herself for years afterward how a person could say those words and mean the opposite. How a person could hold your hand at the altar rehearsal, help you into your shoes, laugh at your jokes, and already be carrying folded inside her handbag the keys to a hotel room 40 minutes away, where Obinna's bags, packed 2 days earlier, though Ada did not know this yet, were already waiting. That night, after the compound had emptied of guests and only shame remained, Ada's mother tried to remove the wedding gown from her daughter's body and found that Ada would not let her. She sat on the edge of the bed until dawn, still dressed as a bride, her veil crumpled in her nap, staring at nothing, while outside in the village, the story of what happened at the Nwasu compound was already traveling from mouth to mouth, growing uglier and more shameful with every retelling. By morning, 3 unanswered questions sat heavy in every heart in that village. Why would Chioma, a woman who ate from the same plate as Ada since childhood, do such a thing? Where was she and Obinna planning to go, and for how long had they been planning it? And the question that would follow Ada for years, the question she herself did not yet dare to ask. Was there more to this than a stolen groom? Was there a reason, deeper and darker, that these 2 people chose her wedding night, of all nights, to disappear? Adaeze Moasu grew up the only daughter of Pa Noasu, a respected cocoa farmer and church elder in their town outside Umuahia. Her mother had given birth to her younger brother when Ada was 12, and from that day she had learned to run a household, cooking, washing, minding her brother Chiguike, while her father walked the farm and led prayer meetings on Wednesday nights. She was known in the village as a hard-working, quiet girl, the kind of mothers pointed to when scolding their own daughters. Look at Ada, she does not waste time on foolishness. Chioma Eze had come into her life differently. Chioma's mother sold provisions at the Umuahia main market and struggled after her husband ran off to Lagos with another woman, leaving Chioma and her 2 younger siblings behind. The 2 girls became inseparable in a way that people puzzled, who liked their friendships neat and explainable. The disciplined farmer's daughter and the market woman's daughter, thick as thieves from 7 years, sharing books, sharing secrets, sharing the small burdens of growing up poor and fatherless and motherless in different ways. It was Ada who paid for Chioma's WAEC registration the year her mother could not raise the fee. It was Ada who gave Chioma a wrapper for her 16th birthday when Chioma had nothing new to wear to church. And when Ada met Obinna at her cousin's introduction ceremony 3 years ago, a tall, soft-spoken young man who worked in logistics and spoke of building a transport business, it was Chioma who squeezed her hand under the table and whispered, "Ada, this one is serious. Marry him." Nobody in that village understood in the days after the wedding why Chioma would betray the one person who had never betrayed her. Nobody understood because nobody yet knew about the land. There was a particular memory Ada carried from their 15th year, one she would return to again and again in the months after the wedding, turning it over like a stone in her palm, trying to find the crack in it that she had somehow missed. Chioma's mother had fallen sick that year, a fever that kept her from her stall for 11 days, and the family had gone without proper food for most of that time. Ada, without telling her own father, had carried a basin of gari and dried fish to the Eze household every evening after school, walking the long bush path alone in the dark, rather than let anyone see and start rumors that might shame Chioma further. On the 12th day, when Chioma's mother finally rose from her mat, she had held Ada's face in both hands and said, "This girl, God will bless you for what you have done for my family, and if my daughter ever forgets it, may he remind her himself." Ada thought of those words often later. She wondered whether God had, in his way, tried to remind Chioma, and whether Chioma had simply been too frightened to listen. She wondered too whether the debt her own kindness had planted in that house all those years ago had somehow, twisted and inverted by Chief Madueke's cruelty, become the very seed from which her ruin eventually grew. That the same poverty she had once tried to ease had left the door open years later for a wealthy man to walk through and take everything. On the morning of the wedding itself, before the drums, before the canopy, before any of it, Chioma arrived at the Nosu compound before sunrise, as she always did on important days, to help Ada dress. She had knelt to fix the hem of the gown, and Ada, looking down at the crown of her friend's head, had felt a wave of pure gladness rise in her chest, gladness that of all the people in the world, this was the one standing beside her on the most important morning of her life. She did not know, could not have known, that Chioma's hands were shaking that morning not from excitement, but from terror, that she had spent the entire previous night on her knees on the cold floor of her mother's room, begging God for a way out that never came. The morning after the wedding, Ada's aunt arrived early, before the sun had fully risen, and without a word, began gathering the uneaten jollof rice, the untouched cake, the crates of soft drinks still stacked by the fence, distributing them quietly to neighboring compound, so that at least the food would not go entirely to waste. It was in its own quiet way an act of mercy Ada would remember long after she had forgotten the sharper cruelties of that week. Her aunt moving through the wreckage of the celebration with steady hands, refusing to let one more thing be wasted by a day that had already taken so much. It took Adaeze 6 weeks to leave her father's house and travel to Lagos. 6 weeks of sitting in church pretending not to hear the whispers, of walking to the stream and hearing conversation stop the moment she appeared, of receiving pitying visits from women who came bearing soup and left carrying gossip. Her father wanted her to stay, to let the shame settle and fade the way shame in a small village sometimes did, given years. But Ada knew that shame like this did not fade. It calcified. It became the only story anyone would ever tell about her. So, she packed one bag, took the small savings she had kept from selling her tailoring work, and boarded a bus to Lagos, telling her father only that she needed to see a different sky. The night before she left, her younger brother Chibuike, only 14 then, sat with her on the veranda and asked the question the whole village was too polite to ask directly. "Ada, do you hate her?" She meant Chioma. Ada looked at the stars for a long time before answering. "I don't know what I feel yet, Chi. I think hatred needs a reason, and I still do not have one. All I have is a wound. Maybe when I understand the reason, I will know what to call what I feel." Chibuike had nothing to say to that, so he simply sat beside her until the fire in the compound burned down to embers, the way he had done every night since the wedding, unwilling to let her sister sit alone with her grief in the dark. The bus into Lagos took 11 hours, and somewhere past the Ore checkpoint, wedged between a woman carrying 2 crates of live chickens and an old man who prayed under his breath for the entire journey, Ada allowed herself, for the first time since the drum stopped, to cry. Quietly, her face turned to the window so that no stranger on the bus would ask her what was wrong. Lagos swallowed her the way it swallowed everyone who arrived without connections or money, completely, indifferently, without ceremony. She found a single room in a Face Me I Face You compound in Ajegunle, shared a bathroom with 11 other tenants, and took a job as a seamstress's assistant in a cramped shop in Trade Fair Market, threading buttons and hemming trousers for a woman named Mama Chidima, who paid her almost nothing and shouted at her constantly. For the first year, Ada told herself this was temporary. For the second year, she stopped telling herself anything at all and simply worked, 16 hours a day sometimes, learning every stitch Mama Chidima knew and many she did not, sketching her own designs late at night by the light of a rechargeable lamp when the compound's electricity failed, which was often. Mama Chidima was not a gentle teacher.
She threw fabric back at Ada's chest when a seam was crooked, called her bush girl in front of customers when she made mistakes, and once, when Ada asked timidly for the wages she was owed after a difficult month, told her plainly, "If you want salary like ordinary staff, go and marry a rich man." "Ah, wait, somebody has already spoilt that market for you, Abi?" The words cut deeper than Mama Chidima could have known, and Ada walked home that evening past the open gutters of Ajegunle with tears she refused to let fall, promising herself silently and fiercely that a day would come when no one would ever again be able to reduce her to the worst thing that happened to her. There were nights in that single room, with the noise of 11 neighbors pressing through thin walls, that Ada ate garri soaked in cold water because there was no money for anything else. There were nights she lay awake doing sums in her head, rent, transport, the small amount she still tried to send home to her father, and found the numbers never balanced, no matter how she arranged them. It was in one such week, when she had gone 2 days without a proper meal to afford new needles for a rush order, that she first understood something about herself that would carry her through everything still to come. That she was capable of bending very far without breaking, so long as she never allowed herself the luxury of self-pity for the more than a single night at a time. It was during this second year, after a particularly difficult stretch in which Ada had fallen behind on rent and briefly considered returning home to Umuahia in defeat, that hope arrived, quietly, in the form of a woman named Mrs. Beatrice Okafo, who came into the shop one Saturday needing an emergency alteration for an event that evening, and found every other tailor in the market either too busy or too careless to help. Ada, on her own initiative, stayed 2 extra hours after closing to get the dress perfect, refusing extra payment simply because the woman had looked so anxious. Mrs. Okafor did not forget that kindness. She ran a growing fashion house that supplied uniforms and corporate wear to companies across Lagos. And 3 months later, she returned to the shop, not for an alteration, but with an offer, a junior position in her workroom, with proper pay, proper hours, and, if Ada proved herself, room to grow. For a while, it seemed as though the worst had been behind her. It was also during this time that Ada met a man named Kelechi, a quiet accountant who attended the same small parish she had joined in Yaba, a man who pursued her with a patience that unsettled her more than it flattered her. He brought her books instead of flowers, walked her home from evening service without ever asking to come inside, and after 8 months of careful, unhurried courtship, told her plainly that he did not need to know the details of whatever had happened before Lagos, only that he could see she was a woman worth waiting for. Ada wanted desperately to let herself trust him, but some nights, lying alone in her room, she would catch herself bracing for the moment he too would disappear, would find some reason, some secret arrangement, some hidden hand pulling him away from her the way Obina had been pulled. When Kelechi was transferred by his bank to Port Harcourt 11 months later and asked her seriously to consider marriage and relocation, Ada found she could not say yes. Not because she doubted him, she told herself, but because some locked door inside her had not yet found its key, and she refused to build a life on ground she had not yet tested for herself. She let him go gently, with real tears, and told no one, not even Mrs. Okafor, how many nights afterward she wondered if fear, dressed up as caution, had cost her a good man. Then came the setback that nearly finished what the wedding night had started. 8 months into her new job, Ada discovered that her father's cocoa farm, the land that had fed her family for 2 generations, the land her grandfather had cleared with his own hands, was under threat. A letter arrived from a lawyer in Mwaya, informing Panosu that a company called Eastgate Development Consortium was contesting the boundaries of his land, claiming that a survey conducted years earlier, one Panosu had never seen or signed, placed a significant portion of his farm within a plot the company had purchased. Panoso, old and no longer strong, could not fight this alone, and the little money Ada sent home each month was swallowed instantly by lawyers' fees that seemed to multiply rather than resolve anything. Ada nearly lost her job trying to manage the crisis from Lagos, taking calls in the workroom bathroom, borrowing against her small salary, lying awake calculating sums that never added up. It was in the middle of this crisis, while digging through old documents her father had mailed her in a battered envelope, trying to understand the original land boundaries, that Ada found something that made her hands go cold. A name on an old community land registry document from 11 years earlier, listed among the witnesses to a boundary agreement her father had signed with a neighboring family. The witness was Chief Maduike, Obina's father. At first, Ada told herself it meant nothing. Boundary witnessing was common. Every respected man in the community was called upon for such things. But something nagged at her, some instinct sharpened by years of quietly surviving, and she began asking questions, cautious, careful questions sent through her father, through an old family friend who still worked at the local government land office. She called her father's old friend, Mazi Okoro, a retired clerk who still had contacts at the land registry, and asked him directly whether he remembered anything unusual about the boundary agreement from 11 years earlier. There was a long silence on the line before he answered, "Ada, my daughter, why are you asking me this now after so many years?" She told him only that she was trying to help her father with the new dispute. Another silence. Then, in a lowered voice, as though the walls themselves might be listening, he said, "There were things about that agreement that troubled me at the time, but I was a small man in a small office, and Chief Maduike was already a big man even then. I signed what I was told to sign. Ada, be careful how you dig. Some ground, once you disturb it, does not let you walk away easily." His warning did not stop her. If anything, it confirmed what her instincts had already begun to suspect, and over the following months, piece by piece, what she learned rearranged everything she thought she understood about her own life. Chief Maduike, Obina's father, had spent the last decade quietly acquiring land around Umuahia through a network of companies, of which Eastgate Development Consortium was only the most recent name. He was patient, methodical, and ruthless in ways the community had never suspected of the polite, church-going chief who sat in the front pew every Sunday. And Panosu's farm, situated at a crossroads that would soon connect to a new federal road project, was one of the last remaining parcels standing between Chief Maduike and a land assembly worth, by others' careful estimate once she understood the road plans, many times what her father's entire life savings could ever have been. A marriage between Obina and Adaeze would have given the Maduike family a foothold, a relationship of trust, perhaps even eventual influence over how Panosu's land was managed or eventually sold, especially once Panosu grew old and Ada, as his only remaining close relative in the village besides her young brother, would have inherited it. But something had happened that changed the calculation, something Ada would not learn the full truth of for 2 more years. It was around this time that an unexpected ally entered Ada's life, a woman who would change the entire direction of her story. Mrs. Okafor, noticing Ada's distraction and the toll the land dispute was taking on her, finally asked her directly what was wrong. Ada, exhausted, told her everything. Not just about the land, but for the first time since arriving in Lagos, about the wedding, about Chioma, about Obina, and about the shame she had been carrying silently for nearly 3 years. Mrs. Okafor listened without judgment, and when Ada finished, she said something that would stay with Ada for the rest of her life. "Adaeze, you have been surviving. It is time you started building. A woman who can survive what you have survived and still show up every day with steady hands and a clear mind, that is not a woman who should be sowing another person's dreams. That is a woman who should be building her own." Mrs. Okafor did more than speak encouraging words that day. She sat with Ada for 3 evenings after closing, reviewing her sketches, correcting her costing, teaching her things Mama Chubima had never bothered to explain: how to price for profit and not merely for survival, how to speak to a client who wanted to negotiate her down, how to say no to work that would cost more in cloth and hours than it would ever return. "You have been thinking like someone who is grateful to be allowed to work," Mrs. Okafor told her one evening, tapping a pen against her badly underpriced quotation sheet. "Ada, you must begin to think like someone who is owed something because you are." It was, Ada would later say, one of the most important lessons anyone had ever given her, and she carried it into every negotiation she conducted for the rest of her career.
Within a year, with a small loan Mrs. Okafor helped her secure, and the design skills she had spent 3 years quietly perfecting, Adaeze opened her own small workroom. 2 sewing machines, 1 assistant, a single rented room in Yaba. She called it Adaeze Couture, and she built it on a principle she had learned the hard way: that trust, once broken, could never simply be rebuilt on the same foundation. It had to be built again from the ground, brick by brick, with people who had earned it. The business grew slower than she wanted, but steadier than she expected. Word spread about the quiet, meticulous seamstress from Ajegunle who never missed a deadline and never cut corners. By the 4th year, Adaeze Couture had moved into a proper shop space on the Lagos mainland, employed 9 tailors, and had begun supplying uniforms to 2 mid-sized companies. By the 6th year, it had grown into something Ada herself sometimes struggled to recognize as the same business she had started with 2 machines and a prayer: a company with contracts across 3 states, a design studio, and Ada's own face on billboards advertising Nigerian-made corporate wear that could compete with anything imported. The day the first billboard went up along the Lekki-Epe Expressway, Ada asked her driver to stop the car so she could simply sit and look at it. Her own face, 20 feet tall, smiling down over traffic she had once trudged through on foot because she could not afford a bus fare, and she allowed herself for the first time in years to weep openly in public, not from sorrow this time, but from the sheer, disbelieving weight of how far she had traveled. The road to that 6th year was not smooth. In her 3rd year of running Adaeze Couture, a larger, better-connected competitor named Silver Thread Apparel undercut her on a major hospital uniform contract by promising delivery timelines Ada knew from experience were impossible to honor with the quality specified. She lost the contract, watched a client she had courted for months walk away, and spent a bitter week wondering whether Mrs. Okafor's confidence in her had been misplaced. But 4 months later, Silver Thread Apparel missed their delivery date by 3 weeks and delivered uniforms with mismatched buttons and crooked hems, and the same hospital administrator who had chosen them over Ada called her personally, apologetic, asking whether she could take over the contract at short notice. Ada accepted, delivered flawlessly and early, and never lost that client again. It taught her something she repeated often to her own staff in later years: that patience, properly used, was not weakness, but the sharpest tool a builder could own. She had done almost no one from her village believed possible. She had turned catastrophe into a company. She had turned public humiliation into private power. And through all of it, she had heard almost nothing of Chioma or Obina. Rumors reached her occasionally, second-hand, distorted by distance and years, that they had married, that they had moved to Port Harcourt, that Obina's transport business had struggled, that there had been no children. Ada had trained herself with great discipline not to ask further questions. She had built a wall around that chapter of her life, and she had for the most part succeeded in keeping it standing. The wall came down on an ordinary Tuesday morning, 7 years after her wedding day, when her HR manager knocked on her office door with a stack of interview files for 3 open positions in the company's growing logistics department. "Ma, we have shortlisted candidates for the transport coordinator role. her manager said, sliding a folder across the desk. There is one applicant, ma. Her experience is unusual. She has worked in transport and logistics for years, she says. Her name is Chioma Maduike. Ada's hand froze over the folder. It had been 7 years. Chioma had married Obinna then. The name confirmed what the rumors had said, and now somehow, impossibly, that same Chioma, the girl who zipped up her wedding gown and disappeared with her husband before the night was through, was sitting somewhere in Lagos, applying for a job in Ada's company, apparently with no idea whose company it was. Ada told her manager she would review the file personally and asked to see all candidates herself for that role. For 3 days, Ada could not sleep. She sat up some nights with the folder open on her lap, staring at the single line of Chioma's typed name until the letters seemed to lose their meaning entirely. She thought of calling her father, of asking his advice as she had asked it so many times before, but some instincts told her that this decision she needed to make entirely alone, the way she had made every important decision since the night the drums stopped. She thought too of Kelechi, gone now to Port Harcourt with a wife and children of his own she had heard about through mutual church friends, and wondered whether she had spent so many years guarding her heart against further betrayal that she had also guarded it against the harder, more necessary work of ever truly setting the old betrayal down. She considered simply rejecting the application without an interview, sparing herself whatever confrontation lay ahead. But something, perhaps the same instinct that had once led her to dig through old land documents until she uncovered a decade of quiet betrayal, told her that walking away from this moment would leave a question mark hanging over her life forever. She needed to see Chioma's face. She needed to understand finally why. When Chioma walked into the interview room on Friday morning, Ada almost did not recognize her. The Chioma she remembered had been vibrant, quick to laugh, dressed always a little more boldly than the occasion called for, carrying herself with the restless energy of a woman who intended to escape poverty by sheer force of charm. The woman who sat across from Ada now was thin in a way that spoke of hardship rather than discipline, dressed in a modest blouse that was clearly been pressed carefully to hide its age, her eyes carrying a wariness that made her look a decade older than her true years. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Chioma looked up, and recognition crossed her face like a physical blow. Her hands began to tremble. She half rose from the chair as if to run, then sat back down as if her legs had stopped obeying her. "Chioma, Ada, Chimo, Ada, is that you?" Ada said, "Sit down, Chioma," and was surprised at how steady her own voice sounded when inside her chest felt like a door being kicked open after years of being locked shut. What followed was not the interview Ada's HR manager had prepared questions for. It was something else entirely. The two women alone in a glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building in Victoria Island. 7 years of silence collapsing into a single unbearable conversation. Chioma wept before she spoke. She wept the way people weep when they have been carrying something so heavy for so long that the weeping itself feels like the only relief available to them. And when she finally found words, what Chioma told Ada was more shocking than anything Ada, even with all her digging into land documents and boundary disputes, had imagined.
"Ada, I did not run away with Obinna because I loved him," Chioma said, her voice breaking. "I ran because his father told me he would destroy my mother if I did not." Ada sat very still. "Explain." "You remember my mother's stall in the market, how she was always behind her rent to the market union? 2 years before your wedding, my mother borrowed money, a large sum, more than she could ever repay, from a moneylender connected to Chief Maduike. She did not know it was connected to him, Ada. I swear before God, she did not know. When she could not pay, the threats began. They said they would seize the stall, throw her into the street with my siblings, even involve the police with false papers Chief Maduike could easily arrange because he knew people everywhere." Ada's stomach turned cold, remembering the boundary document, the name Chief Maduike, witness after witness, patient acquisition after patient acquisition. Then Obinna came to me. Not as your fiancé, Ada, but alone, 3 months before your wedding. He told me his father had a plan. If I helped make sure the wedding never truly happened, if I convinced Obinna to run with me instead, publicly, shamefully, on the wedding night itself, my mother's debt would be forgiven, and my family would be given money to start again elsewhere, far from Umuahia. He told me it did not matter whether I loved him or not. He told me it was already decided that his father had never truly wanted the marriage between him and you to succeed in the way you believed, only to fail in a way that would destroy the Nosu family's reputation, weaken your father, and make it easier later for Eastgate to move against the land, because a family already broken by scandal has fewer allies willing to fight for it in courts. The room seemed to tilt around Ada. All these years she had believed, had built an entire private mythology around a simple story of love and betrayal, a friend who wanted her man. The truth was so much colder than that. She had never been betrayed for love at all. She had been sacrificed, deliberately, as one move in a chess game about land, played by a man she had called chief and greeted with respect every Sunday at church. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Ada asked, her voice hollow. "Because he made sure I could not, Ada. The day after your wedding, before the money was even given, Chief Maduike told me plainly, if I ever spoke a word of this arrangement to anyone, my mother would not simply lose her stall, she would disappear. He said the word disappear the way another man says good morning. I was 23 years old. I was terrified. And Obinna married me 8 months later, not from love either, I think, but because his father decided it would look better, would silence any questions if the scandal ended in a real marriage instead of an obvious arrangement." "There's something else," Chioma said suddenly, wiping her face with the back of her hand, her voice dropping lower still, as though even now, 7 years and hundreds of kilometers removed from Umuahia, she was afraid of being overheard. Ada felt her chest tighten. "Tell me." "The night before your wedding, I went to Chief Maduike's house one final time to beg him to release me from the arrangement. I told him I could not do it, that you were my sister in every way that mattered, that I would rather lose everything than betray you." He laughed at me, Ada. He said, "You think you have a choice? Look outside." And when I looked, there was a car parked across from my mother's store. 2 men sitting inside, men I had seen before, watching. He told me they would remain there every night for as long as it took, unless I did exactly as instructed. He did not need to say anything more. I understood him perfectly. "Why are you telling me this now, and not simply that you were forced?" Ada asked quietly. "Why give me this detail?" Chioma looked directly at Ada for the first time since she had begun speaking. "Because I need you to know that I tried to refuse, Ada. I need at least one person in this world to know that before I did the wrong thing, I first tried, with everything in me, to do the right one. I have carried the shame of not trying enough for 7 years. Please, let me put that particular weight down, even if you cannot forgive the rest." Ada asked the question she had been most afraid to ask. "And were you happy at least, all these years?" Chioma laughed, a broken, humorless sound. "Happy. Ada, Obinna drank. He grew bitter, trapped himself in a marriage his father had engineered for reasons that had nothing to do with either of us. He blamed me for things that were never my fault. 3 years ago, his transport business collapsed. His father had lost interest in funding it once the land deal fell apart. Because, Ada, your father never sold. Somehow, against everything Chief Maduike expected, your father held on to that farm." Ada remembered now, with a fresh understanding, the years of exhausting, grinding legal battles her father had fought, battles she had helped fund from her small early salary, battles that felt at the time like simple bad luck, rather than the tail end of a conspiracy years in the making. Chioma's hands twisted in her lap as she continued, her eyes fixed somewhere past Ada's shoulder, as though it was easier to speak these particular words to the window than to the woman in front of her. 6 months ago, Chioma said, continuing, Obinna left. Not dramatically, not the way he left you. He simply stopped coming home one day, and later I learned he had gone to Abuja with another woman, taking what little money remained. Chief Maduike, his own father, refuses to receive my calls now that I am no longer useful to any plan. My mother's stall is gone anyway. She lost it 2 years ago to circumstances unrelated to the debt, simple market conditions, but it did not matter because by then there was nothing left to lose and no protection left either. I have been surviving on transport logistics work, moving goods for small companies for 2 years, trying to raise my daughter alone. Your daughter. She is 5. Her name is Adaeze. The room went silent in a way that felt like the entire building had stopped breathing. Ada looked at the woman across from her. This thin, broken, exhausted woman who had named her only child after the friend she had wronged, whether out of guilt or grief or some tangled combination Ada could not begin to untangle, and felt something inside her chest crack open that she had spent 7 years reinforcing. Why did you apply to my company? Ada asked. Did you know it was mine? No, Chioma said immediately, and something in her rawness of voice made Ada believe her. Ada, I swear before God and before my daughter's life, I did not know. I saw a job posting for a transport coordinator, a company called ACL Logistics Solutions. I did not connect it to you. If I had known, I would never have come. I could not have borne to see your face and know what you did to me, what was done to you.
Ada sat with that truth for a long time. The two women facing each other across a glass office 14 floors above the city that had swallowed and then rebuilt Adaeze, while somewhere far below, traffic moved and hawkers called out prices, and the ordinary noise of Lagos continued as though nothing extraordinary was happening above it at all. I need time, Ada finally said. I need time to think about everything you have told me. I am not the same girl who stood in that compound in her wedding gown, Chioma. I do not know yet what I feel, but I believe you, and I think for the first time in 7 years, I finally understand what happened to me. That alone is worth something. Chioma left the office that day without knowing whether she would ever be called back for another interview, without knowing whether the woman she had wronged would ever wish to see her again, carrying only the strange, fragile relief of a confession finally spoken after 7 years of silence. 3 days after that conversation, against the advice of the small, cautious voice that told her to keep her distance until her feelings settled, Ada found herself standing outside a Face Me, I Face You compound in Bariga, not unlike the one she herself had once lived in, holding a bag of provisions she had bought without entirely deciding to buy them. Chioma answered the door with visible shock, and behind her, peeking around her mother's wrapper with the frank curiosity only small children possess, stood a girl with Chioma's wide eyes, and Ada noticed with an ache she had not expected, something of Obinna's stubborn chin. "Auntie, who are you?" the little girl asked, unafraid, tilting her head. Ada crouched down to meet her eyes. "My name is Adaeze too," she said softly, "just like you." The child's face broke into a delighted smile, as though this were the most wonderful coincidence in the world, and she reached out and took Ada's finger in her small hand, tugging her toward a corner of the room where a few worn toys were arranged with obvious care despite their poverty. Ada sat on the floor of that cramped room for almost an hour, playing with a child who did not know, and perhaps would never fully need to know, the tangled history that connected her to this stranger who had suddenly appeared bearing rice and tinned tomatoes. Watching them together, Chioma wept silently by the doorway, and Ada, looking up at her over the child's head, felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the first loosening of a knot she had carried for 7 years. What followed in the weeks after that was not the storybook reconciliation a letter story might have offered, nor the clean revenge a bitter heart might have demanded. It was something slower, harder, and far more honest. Ada did not immediately forgive. She spent 2 weeks in a kind of controlled grief, mourning not the marriage she had lost. She understood now, with painful clarity, that the marriage had never truly been hers to lose, that it had been built on a foundation of manipulation from before the invitations were even printed, but mourning the friendship, the real one, the one that had existed before land and greed and a chief's cold ambition had poisoned it. She grieved the 7-year-old girl who had shared a desk with Chioma, the 16-year-old who received a wrapper as a birthday gift, the bride who had trusted those steady hands to fasten her veil. She also, quietly, without telling anyone in Lagos, traveled home to Umuahia for the first time in 3 years and sat with her father, older now, his hands more weathered, but still sharp-eyed and steady, and told him everything Chioma had confessed. Panu also listened in silence, and when Ada finished, he was quiet for a long time before he spoke. I always wondered why Chief Maduaike stopped greeting me properly at church the year after your wedding. I thought it was shame on his son's behalf. Now I understand it was something else. He was watching to see if his plan would work. When it did not, when I held the land, he had no more use for pretending to be my friend. Together, father and daughter decided what to do with this knowledge. Pano also, with other support, engaged a proper lawyer in Umuahia, not the overwhelmed local council who barely kept pace with Eastgate's endless filings, but a sharp land rights attorney from Enugu, whose others growing business connections in Lagos helped her find. Armed now with the knowledge of Chief Maduaike's decade-long pattern of land acquisition through intimidation, and with Chioma, after much soul-searching, and after Ada made clear she would help protect Chioma's mother and daughter from any retaliation, willing to give a sworn statement about the pressure exerted on her family, the case against Eastgate Development Consortium's claim on the Noosu farm began for the first time in 7 years to genuinely favor Panosu. That protection was not merely a promise offered lightly. In the weeks before Chioma's statement was formally submitted, Ada arranged, quietly and through her own resources, for Chioma's mother to relocate temporarily to a cousin's house in a different local government area, out of easy reach of anyone Chief Maduaike might still be able to send. She hired discreetly a young security-conscious driver to escort Chioma and her daughter to and from work during the most sensitive weeks of the proceedings, telling Chioma only that it was a company courtesy extended to all new hires under consideration, though both women understood, without ever saying it out loud, exactly what it truly was. Fear, Ada had learned in her own years of rebuilding, was rarely defeated by courage alone. It required just as often someone willing to stand quietly at your back while you found the strength to speak. It took another 8 months of legal proceedings, during which Chief Maduaike, confronted publicly for the first time by a community he had long deceived with his Sunday piety, saw his reputation collapse in slow, humiliating stages. Other families, emboldened by Chioma's statement, came forward with their own stories of quiet intimidation over land boundaries stretching back years. The turning moment came at a town hall meeting Ada herself chose to attend, traveling home from Lagos specifically for the occasion, though her lawyer had advised her she was not strictly required to appear. Chief Maduaike sat at the front of the hall in his customary red cap, still carrying himself with the bearing of a man who believed his standing untouchable, until the community secretary began to read, one after another, the sworn statements that had accumulated against him. The Okereke family's boundary dispute of 9 years past, the Adigwe family's forced sale of 2 acres at half its value, and finally, Chioma's own statement, read out loud in full, naming him directly in connection with the events of Adaeze Nuosu's wedding night. A silence fell over the hall that Ada would remember for the rest of her life. The particular silence of a community realizing all at once that a man they had trusted with tithes and titles and traditional authority had been quietly preying upon them for years.
Chief Madueke rose to speak in his own defense, his voice at first commanding in the way it had always been, insisting the statements are lies, conspiracies against a respected elder. But when his eyes found Adaeze seated calmly near the back of the hall, something in his composure finally cracked. He had expected, perhaps, that shame would keep her silent forever, the way it had once kept Chioma silent. He had not accounted for a woman who had already survived the worst thing he could do to her and had nothing left to fear from simply being seen.
"Ask your son where he is today, Chief," Ada said, standing slowly, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall. "Ask him what became of the plan you built on my wedding night. I am still here. My father still owns his land, and every family in this hall now knows exactly what kind of man has been sitting among them all these years, collecting their respect under false pretenses." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The hall's silence afterwards said everything that needed saying. Chief Madueke left the meeting that evening a diminished man, and within the year, still more families came forward with grievances long suppressed by fear of his influence. The Federal Road project, once meant to be the crown jewel of his land assembly, was eventually rerouted after a community petition exposed the irregularities in how land around the original route had been acquired. Chief Madueke, who once sat in the front pew every Sunday, stopped attending church altogether, and within 2 years moved away from Umuahia entirely, his name spoken in the village now only in the tones people reserve for cautionary tales. Obinna, Ada learned much later, never returned from Abuja. Whatever life he built there, he built without contacting his daughter, without contacting Chioma, and without, as far as anyone in Umuahia ever discovered, contacting his own father again either. Some betrayals, it turned out, eventually betrayed even the people who committed them. As for Chioma, Ada made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her, including for a while herself. She did not give Chioma the transport coordinator role. That would have been, she felt, too complicated a daily proximity for both of them to bear with honesty. Instead, she offered Chioma something else, a small grant, quietly arranged through Adaeze Koto's community outreach program, to help Chioma start a modest tailoring supply business of her own in a different part of Lagos, along with an old sewing machine Ada herself had once used in her earliest days in Ajegunle, the very machine on which she had built the first designs that eventually became her company. "I am not doing this because I have forgotten," Ada told her, the day she handed over the machine, in a quiet meeting far from the glass offices of Victoria Island. "I have not forgotten, and I do not think I ever fully will. I am doing this because I understand now that you were also a girl caught in a trap someone else built, and because your daughter carries my name, and because I refuse to let what Chief Madueke did to both of our families cost us anything more than it already has. This is not friendship restored, Chioma. That may take much longer if it ever comes at all. This is simply mercy, given because I finally have enough of it to spare." Chioma wept again that day, but differently than before. Not the desperate weeping of confession, but something quieter, something closer to the release of a burden finally set down after 7 long years of carrying it alone. 2 years after that day, Chioma's small tailoring supply business had grown enough to employ 2 young women of her own, girls from Bariga she had specifically chosen because they reminded her, she confided once to Ada, of a certain determined seamstress she herself had watched claw her way up from nothing. The 2 women were not, by then, close in the way they had once been as girls sharing a desk in primary school. Some things, once broken, truly do change shape permanently, no matter how carefully they are repaired. But they had built something else in its place, a wary, honest respect, forged in confession and mercy, rather than in the easy comfort of untested childhood loyalty. They spoke perhaps once a month, attended the same annual Women's Business Fellowship in Lagos, and on the little girls' birthdays, Ada never once failed to send a gift. Papa Nosu lived to see his farmland finally, formally,
permanently cleared of every claim Eastgate Development Consortium had ever pressed against it. The case closed for good in a ruling that named, in its final paragraph, the pattern of intimidation the court had found sufficient evidence to condemn. He died 4 years later, peacefully, in his own house, on his own land, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, having lived to see his daughter become something the village had never imagined possible for a girl who left home in disgrace, riding a rickety bus to Lagos with a single bag and a heart full of unanswered questions. Years later, those who told this story in the villages around Umuahia, and by then it had become a story told often in market stalls and church fellowships and family gatherings, the kind of story mothers used to warn daughters about the hidden costs of greed and the surprising depths of grace. They would say that the true ending was not the collapse of Chief Maduke's empire, satisfying as it was to recount, nor even the survival and success of Adaeze Couture, though every young seamstress in Umuahia knew Ada's story by heart and dreamed of building something half as remarkable as that. The true ending, they said, was smaller and quieter than that. It was two women, meeting occasionally now, years later, in a modest shop in a different part of Lagos, where a small girl named Adaeze, the second one, the one born of betrayal, but growing up it seemed entirely untouched by it, would run to greet her mother's old friend with the uncomplicated joy of a child who understood nothing yet of wedding gowns or stolen grooms or land disputes decades in the making, only that this tall, quietly powerful woman always brought her a gift, and always, without fail, called her by name with a warmth that asked for nothing in return.
Adaeze Nwusu had lost a husband on her wedding night. A husband, she came to understand, she had never truly possessed at all, because he had never truly been given to her freely in the first place. But in the years that followed, through poverty and patience, and a stubborn refusal to let a single night of humiliation define the whole of her life, she had built something no one could steal from her. Not a marriage arranged by other people's ambitions, but a life, entirely her own, standing on ground that in the end, no amount of scheming had ever managed to take from her family. And perhaps that in the end was the truest justice of all, not merely that the guilty eventually fell, though they did, but that the wronged woman rose so high on foundations so entirely her own making that she no longer needed anyone's downfall to feel, at last, complete. Sometimes, on quiet Sunday evenings, Adaeze Nwusu would stand at the window of the home she had built for herself in Lekki, watching the lights of the city she had once entered with nothing but a single bag and a broken heart. And she would think back to that girl in the white gown, standing frozen in the sand, waiting for someone to tell her it was all a joke. She wished sometimes that she could reach across the years and hold that girl's face the way Chioma's mother had once held hers, and tell her what it had taken so long to learn, that the drums stopping was not the end of her story, only the end of a story someone else had tried to write for her without her permission. She thought, too, of Chioma, somewhere across the city in that small Barida workroom, teaching two young women the same stitches Mama Chidima had once thrown fabric at her for getting wrong, and of the second Adaeze, growing taller each year, still running to greet her with that same uncomplicated joy, still entirely unburdened by the weight her name carried for the two women who loved her. Ada hoped, more than almost anything else she hoped for in those quiet Sunday hours, that the child would grow up in a world where such weights need never be passed down again, where daughters would not learn the way she and Chioma both had, that love and land and fear could be twisted together by a powerful man into something that nearly cost two families everything they held dear. She had gone on, in the years that followed, to write the rest of it herself. And it had turned out, against every fear that first terrible night had planted in her, to be a far better story than the one that was stolen from her. Not because it was free of pain, for it was not, but because every page of it, from the poorest room in Ajegunle to the glass office 14 floors above Victoria Island, belonged entirely, unshakably to her.